so much for making the time to join me in this Sentientist conversation.
It's a pleasure, Jeremy. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a real pleasure. And as we talked about before, the idea is it's a series of conversations about, I guess, personal philosophy and focusing on those two fundamental philosophical questions. What's real and what do we believe in, and what matters morally and how do we draw a moral circle? And sentientism is, I guess, a simple, pluralistic philosophical baseline that just suggests that we should commit to using evidence and reason when deciding what we believe. That's naturalistic, and that we should have compassion for all sentient beings when we're thinking about what matters morally when we're drawing a moral circle. So, it's just a series of conversations about how people come to those conclusions for themselves. So, but before we kick off, for people who don't know you, it'd be great if you could give a brief introduction to your life and your work.
All right. So my full name is John Adenitire. I'm presently a lecturer in the law school at QMUL University. I've been here for just over a year. Before this, I was at Birmingham, where I was also a lecturer in law, and I was there only for about a year. And before then, I finished my PhD at Cambridge, where I wrote on conscientious objection for religious and non-religious believers. That's my general background, academic background. I was born in Nigeria, grew up in Italy, but I've been in England for over a decade now. And my parents are Christians. Everyone in my family, in fact, is a Christian. Yeah. And they're evangelical Pentecostals. There's a lot of probably not really mainstream beliefs, a lot of speaking in tongues, lots of charismatic movement, a lot of singing, dancing in church, praying, and laying hands on people to cure them from diseases. So that was my background. Of course, growing up, I was part of that movement too, and I used to be a Sunday school teacher.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I used to indoctrinate, teach kids, so to speak, about Moses and Jesus and things like that. And I think it was really during my teenage years that I went from one extreme, which was being a devout believer myself. I used to do a regular fast, self-imposed, once a month. For the first week every month, I would just do this fasting, a lot of praying, a lot of devotion and meditation and praying. And that was probably my 15, 16. Yeah. And then from there, I became harder to justify my beliefs. I didn't really understand how it was possible the Bible, which was the source of, which in evangelical and Pentecostal teaching is taken as the absolute truth.
Yeah, it's quite a purist perspective, isn't it? That it is, the Word of God and
absolutely. Yeah, very, very literal understanding of the Bible. But I couldn't understand how it could be true, and I couldn't understand how the many rules it had could be justified outside of it. So one thing that struck a chord with me quite early on was the anti-LGBT stance of my community. But more than that, I also saw that there was a lot of mixture of culture and religion. So that the interpretation of the Bible, though there was a big claim for it to be literalist one, I could see very clearly that there are a lot of cultural values, Nigerian cultural values, because that was the environment. There was a big confluence of these two, of the culture and the religious text. So it was clear to me that there wasn't really they weren't literalist enough, but also when they were being literalist enough, I couldn't find good justification for using the Bible as the evidence for what it was. So eventually, growing up, and I should have said my parents are missionaries, reverends, both of them. And so they've set up churches all over the world, especially in Italy. My dad is the president of African churches in Italy. Pentecostal African churches in Italy. So it was a very strict upbringing in terms of we were at church usually 3 times a week, sometimes more, depending on the choir practice or something like that. So yeah, it was a big personal struggle to find my own identity and find my own belief systems out of this, especially because I had a role of responsibility in the church. I was a Sunday school teacher. I was in charge of the kids, and so it took a lot of struggle. What really helped, I think, was when I eventually left living with my parents, went to uni, left Italy to go to uni, to go to Birmingham. That's where I did my undergraduate. Then that freedom, that distance, helped me to then start thinking about these issues more independently. But of course, even before that, my views had changed radically. But I was not ready to come out as a non-believer.
Yeah. So, and it sounds like it was quite a sort of personal process and an introspective process. Or were there other people around you, or things you read, or things you learned that helped in that process, or was it more just working it through yourself?
Yeah, it was very individual, and it was very much an issue of personal identity, struggle of personal identity, not just of beliefs, but personal identity, because my upbringing was very structured in this way, right? The community, my friends, my community, my whole family were literally devoted to this way of life.
It's embedded in every aspect of your life, your work, your friends, your family. Yeah.
Yeah. So I as I said, I grew up and schooled in Italy, and so there was kind of a divide between my family life, where everyone was Pentecostal, evangelical, really committed, and my school friends, Italian school friends, right, where Italy is a majority Catholic country, but in the school environment, I would say not many people, at least not many of my school friends, were committed at all to those beliefs. So there was also this divide, right, between and some of it was also racial, right, because I grew up in Italy with white friends, and I was the only black kid at the point in the whole school.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of the religious stuff and the racial stuff. Everything was kind of these two words. And I wouldn't say that my friends influenced me to be a non-believer. In fact, yeah, they did it, but it was very much of a personal struggle. And the readings eventually, the intellectual part, I would say, came much later, probably during my PhD, where I started reading about naturalism, about secularism, about humanism, and that is where I eventually found the courage to, the courage to have my own convictions, right? Yeah. But also the courage to come out to my parents as an atheist.
Yeah. And how did that process go? I mean, that's a risky and difficult thing for many people. I mean, I found it quite a difficult process over 3 or 4 years to sort of acknowledge that I'd sort of given up on my religious faith and was an atheist. And this is coming from a really, really boring Church of England, non-intrusive background religion where, we probably went to church 2 or 3 times a year, not 2 or 3 times a week. So it was remarkably easy in that sense, but it still felt quite a wrench. But that must have been hard for, when it's embedded in so many aspects of your life.
It was incredibly hard. Yes, incredibly hard. Especially because my parents, especially my dad, had a position of responsibility in the church, right? Both of them, and I would say it was a gradual thing. For several years, it was clear that I wasn't burning with passion for Jesus. And my parents were just hoping that it was a phase. It was a phase, teenage years that you grow out of it. Because my siblings, I have a brother and a sister, also went through similar stages, right? So I think they were hoping that it would be a stage as well. But eventually, when I've had several conversations, especially with my dad, because he's a person we really have lots of conflict, especially because of this issue. Yeah, I got to a stage where we couldn't speak, and even now the relationship is a bit rocky. So yeah, it coming out as an atheist and as a humanist, and later on also as a vegan.
It's like double whammy.
Yeah, cause many frictions. Yeah, and they're still there.
Yeah, that's hard. It varies based on the cultural context and the religion as well. I think many religious people manage to abandon the supernatural aspects, but maintain a rich sort of cultural connection with a religious community as well. But it seems to be easier in some and more accepted in some religious communities than it is in others. So Judaism, for example, many Jewish people are secular Jews who have no supernatural beliefs at all, but are still, richly connected part of the Jewish culture. In other religious contexts and other cultures, it's hard to do. You almost have to be committed to the complete package of beliefs, otherwise it becomes difficult. So
yeah, absolutely. In case of my upbringing, the supernatural beliefs are inherent part of the belief system. It's impossible to separate culture, doctrine, and the supernatural elements. They're all part of the same. And if you reject one, you reject all of it.
That makes it emotionally very hard. I don't want to trivialize it, but as you said, you mentioned already, the veganism side is another cultural challenge, which can be very difficult. And as anyone who's spent any time on Twitter knows, atheism can be challenging, veganism can be challenging, but both at once is almost asking for punishment. Which of those was more challenging as a sort of transition for you in terms of family? And
I would say the religion.
Definitely the religion,
yeah. I would say the religion bit, because the veganism is not as core to the identity of my parents as the religion, especially to my dad, but also the veganism caused lots of friction. Yeah, because it's seen as is an amplification of this view that I was rejecting my upbringing, rejecting not just the religion, but also the culture. Apparently, there's a culture of carnism or something like that. So I guess it's just this feeling of being rejected in significant ways.
That's the difficulty, right? And it's hard to see that it's just an individual intellectual conclusion you've come to. It doesn't feel like that. It feels to them like it's a rejection of things that are deeply important to them. So in a way, you can understand the challenging reaction, but it doesn't make it any easier to go through. So
yeah, no, absolutely. It doesn't. I understand the emotional reaction. Probably, if I had a child and I raised them vegan and they decided not to be vegan, there would be a similar emotional reaction of some sort. So I totally understandable. But I did really try to reach out about the intellectual bits, intellectual arguments, and sat down with both my parents several times. It wasn't always successful.
Yeah. One of the reasons that people are hesitant about moving away from a religious way of thinking is that they fear that their morality will have no basis. They're worried that without, a God, and a perfectly good being who sits in judgment and, even punishes us after death, that without that there can be no good or bad. And so that's a fear I think many people have about moving away from a religious belief. You've made that transition. How would you describe the foundation of your morality now? What is it based on, and how has that thinking changed over time? Because you've mentioned already your veganism. You've clearly gone from a position of moral consideration for humans, and then you've extended that more broadly. How early did that happen in your life, and how's that process worked?
So in terms of veganism, I became vegan just under 5 years ago, and this was during my PhD. So the PhD was really formative, because I think the freedom that I had being after work, I was very lucky because I had a full scholarship. So I had time, I had the luxury of time, and I could really use that to investigate the things that I cared most about. And so in terms of faith and religion, people get it the wrong way round. It is not that you cannot have morality or values without God, but it's that you cannot have God without values. So the religious attitude, our religious sentiment, is one that is based on values of different sorts. And for different people of different religious traditions, the values that are inherent in their beliefs may be different. One common value is that of community. There's a big sense of community in religious in religions, right? You go to church, you participate in these rituals, build your family around these beliefs and these ethos, and that's all good, right? So when religious people say, "Oh, you cannot be moral without God," they really get it the wrong way around. So it's our commitment to value, and I'm a value pluralist. I think there are many things that are valuable in life, and many ways to live a valuable life. And so the way I approach morality is basically trying to live a life of value. Then the next question is, how do I determine what is valuable?
Yeah.
And then that's a personal journey for everyone. But also this idea of respect for value. This will take us in the realm of moral philosophy, and I have to say I'm not a moral philosopher, though I dabble in aspects of moral philosophy. I think respect for values such as friendship, relationships of various kinds. But of course, not just expanding what we're talking about the moral circle, and moral consideration. I think sentient is a sufficient ground for thinking that someone is inherently valuable.
Yeah.
Because they can experience, they have a subjective experience. It's not just about pain, pleasure, but really about having a subjective experience that things can go better or worse for you, right? And that others can impact how better or worse your life goes. I think that brings about the responsibility in others. And this is where the moral concern comes from, right? This responsibility for making our lives and other people's lives better or worse.
Yeah.
And that's how I tend to think about things. That we have a duty to improve people's life, and we have a duty to at least not make their life worse. Try our best. Try the most that we can to not make their life worse.
We're gonna struggle to disagree on anything. That's not how we're supposed to do it on YouTube and podcasts and Twitter. We're supposed to be fighting over something, but I don't think we're gonna. But I agree entirely, right? So some people think of sentience as being, basic pains and pleasures, like a sort of narrowly hedonistic range. And I agree with you. I don't think it's that at all. I think of sentience as the full range of possible types of experience. So that can include physical pains and pleasures, but it can also include a sense of friendship and relationship and connectedness and awe and being at one with the universe and existential angst. It's almost anything qualitatively negative or positive that, an entity can experience. And I love the way you describe a sort of valued pluralism, because there are so many different things that might be important to us as a sentient being. They might be different things, but what counts is that they affect our experience, and it's our perception of that experience that matters most. Yeah, so all of that resonates very, very closely.
Oh, I'm glad we're not having a Twitter war, which is great. Yeah, I really think that subjectivism, this idea that I view ethics as a range of how should I live my life? Yeah. What should I do to do the best I can to have a valuable life? And I view morality as this interpersonal concern about each other's lives. What can we do to make other people's life better, or at least not worse?
Yeah.
So I think it's very simple. It's probably not very sophisticated. I'm sure there are many philosophers that will write books that will disprove this very simplistic view. But at least one merit it has is that it's very simple to explain. I wouldn't though want it to mean that we have no moral duties to non-sentient beings.
Yeah,
I think this is it's very important that there are also epistemic virtues or epistemic values. So even if a being is not sentient, doesn't mean that we have no duties.
yeah.
Take the Mona Lisa or whatever piece of art. It would disrespect the value itself to just destroy the Mona Lisa for any random reason.
Yeah.
So I think we just for that very basic concern for beauty, because beauty itself is divine.
And would you say that's true even if no one will ever see the Mona Lisa, no sentient being will ever experience it? Because personally, I take quite a hard view, in reality we agree, right? I think there's enormous value in the Mona Lisa, but I see all of its value being in the way it provides a positive experience for sentient beings. So I almost see it as very important, but instrumentally important. But in a theoretical universe where there's a Mona Lisa floating in space that no sentient being will ever see, I guess I take quite a hard line and say that is morally, irrelevant. I mean, it may seem a silly conversation, but do you think it would have intrinsic value even in the absence of any sentient being?
I'm not sure. Yeah. That's my honest answer. I do think that there are things that it would be inappropriate for a sentient being to respond to those things without due concern. So like the Mona Lisa, if we put the Mona Lisa next to a can of soda, or whatever.
Both can give pleasure, but
yes, but it would, because for example the history behind the Mona Lisa, not just the artistic configuration, the historical. So I'm not really sure about whether non-sentient things should be taken as only instrumentally valuable. Mm-hmm. But I think that it would be odd for sentient beings to respond randomly to non-sentient things.
Yeah.
Because there's a history, there's a culture, and not necessarily that, there's just aspect of beauty in certain things that we ought to respond in a particular way. We ought not to respond in other ways.
Yeah. And that aesthetic aspect, that aesthetic appreciation aspect of sentient experience is deeply valuable. Again, it's not just the pains and pleasures. So there's I guess a lot of different criticisms of this sentientist view. One, of course, is the religious or the supernatural criticisms. I guess there are two schools of thought. One is a more anthropocentric one that says, no, we should draw our moral circle around humans and exclude non-human animals, which is obviously very common, probably the default. The other is actually that sentientism is too narrow, and that what we should actually do is have direct intrinsic moral concern for elements of the biosphere, so plants, for example, that doesn't look like they are sentient, but they're biological, they're living, or even to ecocentrism, where even rocks and rivers and completely non-sentient aspects of the environment should have moral consideration as well. In a way, I'm reasonably open to the idea that we could have moral consideration beyond sentience, as long as it doesn't undermine the priority we place on sentient beings. And it does feel to me that a lot of the modern environmental and conservation movements seem to make that mistake, in that they go from an anthropocentric moral circle where we're concerned about all of humanity, and that's partly where the environmental and climate change concern comes from, because we can see the negative impact of climate change on humanity. And in response, they jump to extend their moral circle to include things like rocks and rivers and plants, which you could see as a positive step, more holistic appreciation for our responsibility. But at the same time, they skip over trillions of farmed and wild sentient animals that absolutely can suffer. So it feels to me as though the average environmentalist has more direct moral concern for a river or a mountain or a plant or a tree than they do over a sentient being that absolutely can suffer. That's part of my concern about the ecocentrism or biocentrism is I'm sort of open-minded about those things, but please don't forget the trillions of sentient beings. It's almost as if they've gone from having a moral circle to a two-layered moral donut where they've missed out a strip in the middle. So that's part of my concern about, even broader moral circles, is that they can sometimes, have that side effect.
So I think if you look at it as on the basis of respecting values, then you can see why environmentalists, as you put it, may be overstepping, right? Because sentient beings have an interest in, for example, not suffering, not dying, because they have this interest.
Yeah, I mean, their sentience is almost the root of their interests or needs. I mean, I'd almost argue without sentience, you can't have an interest in anything, right?
Right, but you can be of value.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is the point. The rivers, the flowers, trees, the environment, they can be of value. Now we can dispute what value it is. Is it just aesthetic value? And if it's just aesthetic, that may take us far enough, right? Not to, for example, not to litter, which is a silly example, or not to.
And that aesthetic value is also really important, because I think some of the people, ecocentrists and biocentrists I talk to, they're nervous that if we have a sentiocentric view or a sentientist view, our approach to the wider environment is just we want, hard technical ecosystem services to enable us to stay alive and survive. And it's like, no, that's not what sentience is. Right? Sentience is also the rich aesthetic appreciation for nature. So I think in practical terms, most sentientists also want, a rich, verdant, diverse ecosystem for us to be part of as well, because that aesthetic appreciation is deeply valuable too. But yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off.
The only footnote I would like to put in is that there may be some times where our aesthetic appreciation for the environment may require us to frustrate some of our expectations of sentient beings, right? We may have to make some sacrifices, right?
Yeah.
Sacrifices that we wouldn't want to make, because in order to preserve the beauty of the environment. So yes, I do think that our interest in sentient beings should usually be prioritized, but of course, life is not always as straightforward as that, and there may be instances where we have to sacrifice in order to preserve the beauty. Right? Artists sacrifice a lot when they have to create their art, Mona Lisa, and sometimes they have to sacrifice a lot in order to preserve the Mona Lisa at a lot of cost. So I think it's this same way of viewing.
It comes back to your earlier point, right? Neither of us are sort of professional moral philosophers, work in different fields, and there's enormous value in a lot of the complexity and richness of moral philosophy, and lots of different schools of thought about how to play off those trade-offs and those, trolley problems. But I think what's most important is the really simple, practical philosophy we're discussing, which is, whether you're a deontologist or you're a utilitarian or you apply virtue ethics, or how much you weight different sets of aesthetic interests against other types of interests, or whether you use a Maslow's hierarchy or something else. Right? That's all really interesting. The baseline that I think is most important to set is that however you're working that out, you should at least grant moral consideration to every sentient being. So it doesn't solve all of the problems. It doesn't explain how to resolve those trade-offs, but it just says very simply, at least in your moral calculus, you cannot ignore any sentient being as you're working it through. So I quite like the idea of having that really simple baseline, so that we can say, right, we commit to naturalism, we commit to moral consideration for all sentient beings, and then we can still fight about all the other stuff for as long as we like. But it almost feels to me like there's more value in getting more people up to that baseline than there is in the detailed philosophy, because at the moment, when you look around the world, most of the 8 billion people on the planet disagree with naturalism. They hold supernatural beliefs that also warp their ethics often in painful ways. And they also have a way of drawing the moral circle that, certainly for most people excludes most non-human animals. They might include companion animals and charismatic wild animals, but other wild animals and farmed animals are certainly practically excluded. Of course, we also know there are many humans who exclude other humans from their moral circle, or at least denigrate them. So to my mind, actually trying to get more people up to that very simple baseline potentially has more value in driving us towards a decent future than, working out the details of some crazy trolley problem thought experiment. But that might just be because I'm not clever enough to understand that stuff. So I stick with the simple.
I think in terms of outcome, we agree. The only proviso I'll put to what you've said is that this simple baseline that you have outlined and that we both agree on is also the product of moral theory, moral philosophy, and so we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? So we shouldn't denigrate the process that brought us to the academic process and the moral philosophical thinking, going back to Bentham or even earlier, that brought us this idea of naturalistic worldview and sentientist worldview. So yes, I agree that we don't have to teach the word about trolley problems or differences between intrinsic and instrumental values and value pluralism, value monism. All of this complex terminology is not needed. Not yet, but that we should acknowledge that a lot of our own thinking, however simple we can put it forward, is also the product of intellectual giants.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a danger in something that seems to me very commonsensical and almost tautological, right? What other way could there be of understanding reality but evidence and reason? And how else could you draw your moral circle except using sentience? That there's a risk that becomes a dogma in its own right. But the naturalistic commitment always needs to be open to new evidence, new ideas, never being 100% confident about anything outside of formal systems, and always ready to question and doubt even those foundations and leave them open to challenge. So
absolutely. In fact, I would want to take this a bit further. I think we have a duty to, as part of this naturalistic worldview, to actually engage with views that systematically undermine both naturalism and scientism in general. So we have a duty to engage in that. As an example, I hope it doesn't come across as virtue signaling. Even though I hold many progressive views, I every day try to watch or engage with conservative outlets like Fox News, for example. And some of my friends, housemates, criticize me because they say, "Why are you watching that garbage?" And I say, "Well, I think it's our duty to reach out to people, or at least not just reach out, but be receptive to views that systematically undermine our own, and to be able to be open to challenge those views or at least understand them."
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's two reasons for that, at least. One is the epistemological one about evidence and reason and naturalism and always being open to new evidence and new ideas. And if you're not willing to listen, you're not going to hear new ideas. But it's also the compassion side of sentientism, in that it's very easy to have compassion for people we agree with, within our own tribe or our own political system or, our own group. But that's not what sentientism is saying. It's saying you have to have compassion for all sentient beings. And that includes people you disagree with on Twitter or someone who voted for Trump or or someone who voted for Jeremy Corbyn or whatever the group might be. You have to have compassion, even for people you disagree with. And that compassion means you can be robust in your views and you can challenge their ideas and you can be direct and you can be clear. But you have to have compassion for them as an individual, understand why they hold those views, where they came from. Maybe they were subject to their own indoctrinations, as we all are. And because that's the only way we can constructively have conversations and try and move things forward. Compassion doesn't mean weakness, and it doesn't mean appeasement, and it doesn't mean you roll over and let bad people do bad things, right? You can be remarkably firm and robust in your compassion, but I think you have to have those two aspects. I had some conversations recently off the back of what's going on in the States, where some people I know reasonably well were making some very broad generalizations about 47% of the US population and just categorizing them as racists and Nazis and fascists. And it's like, some of them are definitely, but half the country, right? Look at some of the surveys, think about the demographics, listen to some people and understand that there's some individual realities underneath that group you've just defined. And you can appreciate the emotion and the reaction and the tribalism of just wanting to cut a group of people off. But we know where that ends, right? So it's not a good place. So I agree. I think there's an epistemological reason and a compassionate reason to still try and engage and understand views that we find difficult and that we disagree with. So.
Absolutely. We are agreeing a bit too much.
Yeah, exactly. We've got to find something. So, that's been brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that sort of story about what you've come to think is real and what matters to you morally. And it's interesting because, I think we agree that, to me, they link together very closely, because in a way, my ethical stance is actually grounded in naturalism, because I don't need a supernatural judge to tell me what's right or wrong, or a standard. But at the same time, I'm not going to go down a completely, relativistic view where I say, anything goes and it's just up to individual cultures to agree what's right. My stance is actually grounded in a naturalistic understanding of us as sentient beings and non-human animals as sentient beings, and our physiology and the way our brains work and the way our consciousness operates, and what suffering and flourishing mean to us as, in technical terms, almost patterns of information processing, right? So the root elements of my ethics, the things that they're based on, sentience and sentient beings, are actually things I have come to a naturalistic understanding of. So while lots of people will see the naturalism over here and the ethics over here, for me, they've become linked, quite bound together. It's interesting to see how those threads flow through. But it would be good to talk a little bit now about, if you imagine we can persuade everybody on the planet to agree with us. So we're now in a position where more of the world's population are committed to that open-minded evidence and reason, has some basic level of compassion for all sentient beings. I'm interested in your view as to what that future might look like. And you can go, super sci-fi, a few hundred years, or you can think medium or short term, and how you think we'll get there. And I'd be interested to also think about how some of your work, I don't know, particularly the human and animal rights stuff, might play into that. But I don't know how optimistic or pessimistic you feel, but how do you think the future could develop if we can persuade more people to agree with us?
In terms of how do we get to a sentientist future, two ways. I used to be confident that just by providing information to people, they could come to their senses.
Yeah, if only.
And see, clearly, there's no good reason for believing God. Look at all this scientific evidence that puts that into doubt. Or clearly, you should be vegan because X, Y, Z.
My logic is irresistible.
Yeah, I've come to the view that our emotions come first. Emotional reactions come first, and then philosophy does the work of post facto justification, your rationalization. So I think the discussion we were having earlier about empathy is actually the way that we are more likely to get there at some point. Or at least it will take us there. Trying to get people to abandon the emotional comfort of the way they have been brought up. It can be in relation to belief in God or belief in human supremacy, and showing that the alternative actually is not as emotionally draining or as emotionally negative as people would like. And one way, I suppose, it sounds super cliche, but it's just being an example, showing that your life is a life of value and of virtue, and that other people can point to you as someone that they wouldn't mind emulating, right?
Yeah.
So just by showing that you are in good health, or that you are in an emotionally stable place, you make it more likely that people have a positive reaction to whatever belief systems that you advocate. Another thing is convenience. We have to work with selfish human nature.
Yeah.
So especially in terms of veganism, basically we have to play the capitalist game. And I think many entrepreneurs are doing just that. Vegan alternatives are super accessible through the free markets, through capitalism, basically.
I think you're right. I think there's a really interesting example there, because We'd love to think that moral argument would just persuade people to give up animal product. And with some people it does. People have been taught from birth by society and parents that it was completely normal to have sentient beings harmed and killed for us to consume. It feels still very normal to do that in society. There's still this sense that veganism and associated ideas are, weird or unusual or socially strange. And it's that emotional and those social norms that are stopping people from doing it. So ironically, as the alternatives become easier and more prevalent and cheap, fast, easy, much less environmentally damaging, as they arguably already are, you'll almost get to the point where I think people will end up going vegan almost by accident without really taking a decision, because the alternatives are so prevalent and easy and available. And that will actually free them to then update their ethics. After their behavior's shifted. I think it will be much easier for people to become ethical vegans, once they already are, than actually, taking the ethical shift. And I wish it was different, but I think we have to be realistic.
Yeah, it doesn't really bode well for me, my profession as an academic, as someone that is teaching, and I teach mainly legal philosophy. Persuasion, moral, philosophical persuasion doesn't work. It's a shame. I believe I wish it was different. But I think it does work. It does have an important role. But this idea of emotional connection and convenience really is more practical. It's more immediate. And then the rationalization, the ethics, the arguments come afterwards. Yeah. Mm. So in terms of when will this happen? When are we going to have a naturalistic worldview and our moral circle expand? I am not confident that will happen very soon. In terms of the naturalistic worldview, in fact, I'm confident that it may never happen because of the strong emotional attachment that religiosity has. Yes,
and in a way, I'm reasonably relaxed about that. Because of my compassion for people who have religious and supernatural views, I want them to be free to believe what they want to believe. I don't want to enforce that or control it or constrain it in any way, so people can believe what they like. My primary concern is where those beliefs are used to justify constraining, harming, or even in extremis killing other people because of those. So as long as we can get to a position where people might still hold supernatural views, but they're not using that to justify causing harm or warping ethics, I'm completely comfortable with that situation continuing for as long as they want to continue. But it does seem quite difficult to avoid that warping of ethics, partly because in many of the supernatural views, something is being promoted as more important than sentient beings. So whether it's a god or a church or an institution or a autocratic leader or a nation state, or, it doesn't even have to be religious. As soon as a way of thinking puts something as more important than suffering and death, you tend to get quite a lot of suffering and death. But if we can get to a position where we have total freedom of belief, but that's no longer being used to justify or cause harm, I'd be quite comfortable with that carrying on forever. So,
well, this idea of freedom of belief and freedom of religion and conscience, in law at least, has never been an absolute license to do whatever you want. And so we can take this a step further, that it's not just about what you have a legal right to do or what you don't have a legal right to do. It's also what you shouldn't do, morally speaking, a very legal and moral obligation that way. So yes, the fact that you think that Jesus permits you to eat a beef burger is not necessarily a good reason for you to do so. Right?
Yeah.
And Jesus definitely doesn't oblige you to eat a beef burger. And I don't know of any divinity or assumed divinity that obliges you to do that, other than, I suppose, animal sacrifice, which in some religions is still mandated. But I think that those are smaller.
Yeah.
So yes, I do think that I am pessimistic in terms of religiosity, in terms of compassion, at least practical compassion, or more vegan future. I think the the more we develop in terms of economics, in terms of education, in terms of having these products easily available to everywhere, in everywhere in the world, and people actually seeing the health benefits of moving towards a plant-based diet. But of course, veganism is not just about what we eat. At least this incremental changes. I'm a bit more optimistic, mainly because it's just market for it. Yes, I'm not a big capitalist. I think that we need to really think about how free the markets should be. But in our current situation, there's this huge amount of return.
Yeah, agree. And as we close out, you're focused in the legal space and in the rights spaces. What role do you think the fields of law and animal and human rights can play in that somewhat pessimistic context of how hard it is to make change happen? So I've somewhat cheekily rewritten the Sustainable Development Goals in a sentientist context, and I've even redrafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a universal declaration of sentient rights to sort of try and integrate human and animal rights as a thought experiment. Do you think that the rights and legal fields will follow public opinion and generic developments, or do you think they can actually break new ground and help accelerate progress?
So this comes back to what we were discussing earlier, right? That what we and I mean you and I take as simple moral facts, actually were the product of academic development, right? Of thinking, thinking. So I'm hoping that academic thinking can have that we're doing on these issues can then become that basic common sense ground. And but you need to do the heavy lifting, right? So just like you, I'm interested in the idea of the continuity between human rights and animal rights. I've been writing a paper, which will go into a new book, where we don't need to be redrafting human rights documents to include animal rights, where these documents that already exist, these catalogs of fundamental rights, can be understood to cover not just humans, but also non-human animals. Yeah. And in fact, we are like some way into that, because human rights catalogs are used to afford fundamental rights to non-humans, such as churches, corporations, associations. So this idea that we need to redraft existing bills of rights or fundamental rights, I can see why you would want to do that. Yes, why I'd like to think that that is in principle, though pragmatically, but in principle is not necessary. That there's already a rich corpus of fundamental rights which animal rights advocates can tap into. I'm encouraged because I think there was a decision in the Islamabad High Court which did exactly that, used existing human rights or fundamental rights, constitutional right instruments to guarantee certain rights for certain non-human animals. So I believe that academic thinking on this line can really make a difference, and is actually already happening.
Yeah, and because I don't think rights are some sort of magical thing that's bestowed on entities. They're just a tool we can use to protect things that we see have value. So in that context, I agree, because although I did redraft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a total amateur, the thing that surprised me is how little I needed to change it. Because while there are some rights, like the rights to an education, or maybe the rights to employment, or some of the other things that you might think are higher up the Maslow's hierarchy that maybe it doesn't make sense to grant to animals, the most important ones we have in common. So when you think about security and sustenance and the right to continue living and the freedom from physical and emotional harms, all of the things that we as humans see most as our most important rights that most deeply need protecting because they're at the base of the hierarchy, we share with all sentient beings. So I was really surprised at how little I needed to change to create that Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. And as you say, whether it's in Islamabad or some of the stuff that's going on in the US or some of the things that are going on in Switzerland, people are taking some really innovative approaches, whether it's about extending the concept of personhood and just to sort of stretch the court's thinking and actually our own human intuitions about, if we care about the suffering of humans, why not care about the suffering of non-humans? It's difficult. I tend to be optimistic by nature, but I think there is some really interesting work going on there. So
yes, and I hope to contribute in this regard too.
I've used up a lot of your time already, but it's been a genuine pleasure talking to you, and we've found almost nothing to disagree about. Are there any other themes you'd like to explore or things you'd like to touch on before we wrap up? Or
I suppose I should do a bit of self-promotion. So I've just published a book from which is called The General Rights to Conscientious Objection, the humanist idea that this idea of conscientious objection that used to be reserved for religious individuals, or is commonly thought to be reserved for religious individuals, actually is available to the religious and non-religious alike. And in fact, it should be. So I make both philosophical and legal arguments for that conclusion. And that is available in every good store, published by Cambridge University Press. In terms of papers I'm working on, or things that I publish, you can find them on my Queen Mary portal website. And also I have a Twitter account, Dr. John Adenitire, and there I share my views on both humanist and vegan and sentientist issues in general. So that's how you can follow me. Yeah.
That's brilliant. And I'll include all of those links in the show notes as well so that people can pick them up and click and follow you. So, yeah. So, John, it's been a genuine pleasure. Thank you very much for the conversation.
It's a pleasure for me too. Thank you.
And I'd love to do it again sometimes. We'll have to think of something to disagree about next time.
Yeah, let's try.
Yeah, and it's great to have you in our group, our Facebook group as well. So
yes, I enjoyed that too.
And as I say, my final thank you is just, as you've said, one of the most important ways we can drive change is just normalizing these ways of thinking. And hopefully by sharing these conversations, we're doing a tiny thing to do that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, John.